Sasha, how are you?
I'm great, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Good.
Let's talk a little bit about how you got into AI and poetry. So, if I have this right, you graduate from Harvard, you go to Oxford, you start writing poems, and then it's about 2018 and it's GPT-2. So, what was it that made you say, you know what, I've just been writing poems with pen and paper, and now I'm going to use this kind of half-baked AI model?
Yeah, well, going back even further than that, so I've always loved both poetry and technology. Like, I grew up in a house that was very interested in science and engineering, but also grew up with tons of books around me. So I've always been really, really interested in the confluence of all these different things, and been writing poems actually about technology for as long as I can remember.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah,
a poem about the VCR? Like, tell me about your first poem about technology.
Well, I was writing poems about like Greek automaton when I was younger. I was studying the classics, and thought it was really interesting to think about ancient robots and things like that. And then I remember reading Brave New World in school and writing all these poems, thinking about the future, thinking about what it might be like. And like many of us, I'm older than a lot of people here, but we're probably in the same. Some of us are in the same little zone where I was born, in 1980. So like, grew up in a very analog mode in a childhood that was really, didn't have computers, didn't have phones, was outside all the time, and then kind of grew up right into that crazy experience of dialing up to AOL for the first time, and getting to start typing my essays out on a computer as opposed to writing them in blue books and things like that. And it was just always on my mind, like, this is so weird. I went from doing something very different to now sitting at a computer. I remember going overseas to Oxford, as you mentioned, and leaving home really for the first time. And I remember sitting at my computer, my laptop in Oxford, my first laptop, sending messages to my friends back home, and just thinking, like, this is so weird. I am touching them through these fiber optic cables that are running under the ocean. And I thought that was so fascinating, and we weren't really thinking, I don't know, deeply about them in the way that felt really resonant to me. So
that
I wanted to start.
Okay, so you're always interested, you're always looking. I started playing with GPT-2 too. I started using it to help write bedtime stories for my children. So you then start to write poems, it starts to evolve, you go GPT-2, 3, 4. You now have a system, you had a big poem, it was exhibited at MoMA, Mazel Tov, that's pretty awesome. Explain how it worked, right? Explain the prompts you use, explain the post-training, explain the data you put into it, and let's hear, because it's not just, hey machine, write me a poem, it's quite different. So explain that process, and let's get into what that means.
Yeah, so first I'll say, when I started to get involved in natural language processing, it was because I had this background in language and literature. I'd studied humanities at school, and I'd also been sort of just devouring a lot of information about, these underlying technologies and about AI. And so in 2017, when Attention Is All You Need came out, I became fascinated thinking about transformer architecture.
Wait.
I was a nerd.
Are you serious? You read, you and Alec Radford or OpenAI are the two people who noticed that paper is the thing that's going to change the world?
Well, I was obsessed with things like, okay, there were some really cool creative coders.
All of Google didn't notice that paper was going to change the world in 2017.
No. So I'm not saying I noticed it was going to change the world. Okay. However, I was following some really interesting data poets and creative coders like, does anyone here know Ross Goodwin, who's an amazing, amazing poet? He was working with AI in 2015, 2016, was working closely with Google. Folks like, Alison Parrish and Nick Montfort, who'd been using computational systems and who'd been working with AI in different ways. And so I'd kind of gone down the rabbit hole, on GitHub, and, just reading these people's open source code and reading essays that they'd written about all this. So it was kind of in my periphery, and I didn't know anything about it. So it just sort of drew me in a little bit. As someone interested in language and literature, it just kind of sparked something, and I was like, I don't know anything really about the hands-on experience of these tools, but I know as a writer, I need to know about this approach, these systems that are able to write like humans. As a writer, I can't not, look into this further, so that's how that started. So yeah, it was really a long process of just diving in and trying to, teach myself as much as I could to begin to use some of the available systems in those very rudimentary ways, to begin to try to use both no-code platforms. I remember things like Talk to Transformer were available very early on, but there were other ways I could kind of, in a very basic level, go in and use my baby coding skills to begin to use my own poetry that I've been writing my whole life to start fine-tuning these underlying models. And that's the approach that I had taken.
So you take the model, the base model, you upload all of your poems, you say, study these poems, and now you say you're going to be my collaborator and we're going to write new poems?
That's how I started early on. It was as simple as that.
Kind of poetic. If I've read the literature correctly, like the prompts are not write a poem like Sasha. They're, find meaning in the empty spaces. Like tell me more about the prompts you're using.
Well, it's different for every project I work on. I mean, a big part of my interest in all this is exploring how I can prompt AI models and how I can train them in different ways. Not a one-size-fits-all, but there might be some projects where it is a little bit more open-ended or poetic or philosophical, and there's others. I'm working on a project right now, and actually I did one for Google last year that was a much more meticulous, very, very intensive prompt architecture. So I was essentially creating multiple training data sets and then calling those from P5.js, and I had created this structure. Basically, I had composed this structure that was, calling in examples that I had written, calling in synthetic examples that were based off what I had written, and then referring to a set, basically a guidebook, a handbook. I had created a mini manual for this AI poet to sort of look at the samples and then take bits and pieces of it in various ways, tweak parameters and all that, and then come back with constantly variable outputs. So sometimes it's very involved, sometimes it's a little bit more hands-off. The first poem I ever really wrote with GPT-2 was actually just using the generic off-the-shelf model, and it was when I was still very early on in experimenting, and I did it by just taking one line. I took the question, are you ready for the future? And I asked my interface over and over again, are you ready for the future? And I tweaked parameters, and I took all of the outputs, and I kind of collected them as found poetry and curated my 30 favorite outputs into a poem cycle. And so it runs the gamut.
Okay, so this is pretty interesting. So you're doing a couple of things that are unique-ish. You're uploading your own information, right? So you're doing a little bit of the post-training. The prompting is interesting. You're right. Tell me about the future, right? There's like sophistication in the prompts. And then there's sophistication in the selection, presumably. You just said you took the 30, right? You didn't take them all. So as you do these different things, do you think of the AI as like an instrument? It's like a piano and you're playing it? Or do you think of it as like a collaborator?
I love that you said instrument, because everyone always asks if I think of it as a tool or a collaborator. And actually, instrument is a word I use a lot. So I often describe it actually as becoming an alter ego when I use AI. Not that it's a collaborator that I'm working with, but that when I strap on this prosthetic imagination, or when I get into a flow and I'm working with an AI system, I am becoming a third voice that is not me, and it's not the AI, but it is this other entity that is emerging from the interaction of both of us. Same thing, these systems, they can't do what they're doing in that case without me. So it really is about the symbiosis, or about the interaction of the two.
Can they not do it without you? I mean, let's say I went there and I took all of Sasha's poems and I said post-train on these, and I read an interview with you and I know the prompts you use, and I use the same prompts, I use the same training data, I've used the same model. I'm going to get a pretty similar output, right?
Well, if you were to take exactly the same, the piece at MoMA, for example, was a 10,000-line code sketch that was animating multiple text generators and sort of pulling them together in different ways. So, in theory, if you were to literally just use that exact same thing, you might find a lot of similarities there. But I think really there's so much intricacy, I think, to what I'm trying to build. And it really isn't about creating something that can be necessarily repeated. It's not about creating something formulaic. It's sort of about creating an environment so I can sort of test language and play with language. And that kind of leads me in directions that I think are very personal to me. It's, not just about, okay, well, this came out, this sounds familiar. It's sort of about creating a space. You know, I consider all these training models spaces where I can play and can decide, you know, based on what I want, you know, go this direction, go that direction, you know, get more complicated, get less complicated. I think there's so much that is very artful about it and is very creative. It really is unique.
How much do you care about copyright? Like, would it annoy you if I took all of your published works and I uploaded it into an AI model and started using it? And does it bother you that all the AI companies have taken your work already and not given you any compensation?
So this is obviously a thorny topic, right? Because on the one hand, I am
So I hear it.
I am very mindful of the fact that there's a lot to be said, and reviled about techno-capitalist extractive approaches to AI on the one hand. And I think the reason a lot of my friends in the world of art and literature are so up in arms about these, big tech approaches to AI is because they don't want their work to be exploited in this way. Taking the techno-feudal part of it, if I just kind of strip it back to the ethos of all art is collaborative, all of my poetry is borrowing from other voices and other ideas. All of it is sort of, it exists because of all the reading and all of the inspiration I've ingested over the course of a lifetime. I find it very hard to start to tease that out and say, this is where it's okay and this is where it's not okay. And I think for myself, like I was just sort of suggesting, I feel very confident in the fact that the work I'm doing, I don't think anyone else can do. It's very personal to me. It's very weird and it's my interests and it's all very, very much, I'm at this point because of all the strange lived experiences I've had that are, unlike anyone else's. And they've brought me to this point where I can do something that no one else can do. So I'm very happy to have, my texts ingested into the system so they're part of the conversation. That's fine. That's what art is. It's all, it's all of our inside thoughts and all of our innermost, ideas that we've put out into the world because we want other people to interact with them, because we want other people to iterate on them and build on them.
That is very generous and very big of you. But now let me make a counter argument, right? So if somebody goes into the library, right, and they go and they read The Atlantic from 1857, they read it from Ralph Waldo Emerson to Katie Weaver, they read it all. I'm thrilled. You know what? I'll make them lunch. I'll give them a tote bag, right? I'm excited. That's great, right? If somebody creates a company and it goes in and reads it all instantaneously, it doesn't pay me, and then it creates a competitive product, I'm not psyched, right? I do agree that it's nice to have The Atlantic in the conversation. All art is collaboration, all media is collaboration, but it seems like there's a difference in the way things are being shared now versus before.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that's interesting and why I'm glad to sort of have been part of the journey from I guess pretty early on is to see how much the underlying models are changing. And one of the things that I personally have experienced in my own work is the fact that these generic models in and of themselves are not actually that good at, plagiarizing. They're not going to actually take something that they've read and really pass it off, as something novel or something new. My approach, like I said before, has always been really to sort of layer something on top of that generic model in order to make it more personal, to give it a point of view, to give it a perspective and a voice. And to me, that's really important to sort of think about the difference between the underlying off-the-shelf model as being sort of this soup of language where everything's being ingested, not with the intent to replicate, plagiarize, in an ideal scenario, but in order to create a system where the rules of grammar and syntax, where idioms and commonly understood systems, and alphabets are all in there so we have a common ground. It's creating that common ground, and then my job is to then come in and create sort of a layer above that gives it my voice and my point of view. And I think that's sort of, this agentic world that we're moving towards, that sort of everyone beginning to realize we need to do more than just sort of use that baseline model as is.
One thing you've said in the past that has interested me is you've talked about how poetry is it's a particularly good art form for collaboration with AI as opposed to other art forms. Explain to me what you mean by that.
Right. So, well, as a poet, I would say, first of all, I'm thrilled to be here at a conference about, AI and machines. It's nice to have a conference about art and machines. I think that's a really cool thing, right?
You guys get invited everywhere. Poets are like very high status artists.
Oh, well, that's not how it feels from the inside sometimes, but that's lovely to hear. But I think like the reason I've been so interested in all this is because, you know, my belief is that poetry is not just an art form. I mean, I'm told all the time that it's really weird for me as a poet to be engaging with AI because poetry is really the essential human art form. It's the quintessential human art form, and that poetry is all about emotion. And so when I tell people that I'm working with technologies like AI, they think, well, that's crazy because that is the antithesis of what poetry is. You know, technology is sterile and formulaic and soulless, and it has no emotion. And so I think for me, like that's actually been really productive because it's led me to really think a lot about the fact that our ideas of poetry are actually really counterintuitive and maybe wrong in some ways. Poetry didn't actually evolve as an art form. It didn't evolve as a decorative, mode of language. It didn't arise because we wanted to, make beautiful sounding speech. It arose because before we had written alphabets, before we had the printing press or the ability to externalize memory, we had to invent poetic devices like meter and rhythm and rhyme and alliteration in order to enable us to preserve and transmit our stories and our memories. So it really, in a very genuine way, was, a technology. It evolved as a data storage system. And I think that is something that doesn't sit well with a lot of people because, again, it sort of troubles this idea of this essential human art form. But what I find really sort of intriguing about that is the idea that poetry might actually be a blueprint or a model for how we have been able for many thousands of years to bring the human and the machine, to bring emotion and algorithm together in ways that actually make us more human and not less human, as is the fear with so much of the rise of AI.
It makes a lot of sense, and I can also see poets disagreeing you. I just had an image of like someone telling Pablo Neruda that like poetry is a data storage system and how he would react. But let me ask you a question about this concept of cognitive offloading. So, right, you use Waze and you kind of lose your sense of direction. You use a calculator, you kind of forget how to do math. As you've started to write poems with AI, have you lost any of your ability to write poems? Like if I were to say, you know what, Sasha, pen and paper, I want you to write me a poem. Would it be as good as what you would have written in 2016?
I mean, good is so subjective.
In fact, let's do it, Sasha. Write me. No, just kidding.
Let's do a demo. I think it's made me a better poet in a lot of ways because it's really, look, working with AI has taught me more than...
Not the poems that you write with AI.
My human poems. I think it's made me think much more critically and much more deeply about what a poem is, what it means to write a poem, what a poem can be. I think, I never studied poetry formally. I didn't take an MFA or anything, but I've done lots of workshops and, I've read my whole life. And even so, I kind of have I came to a certain point of my life with a very rigid understanding of what good contemporary poetry is. And, I had studied with teachers who are considered very good at their craft, and they had a very rigid idea of what I should be writing about and how I should be writing about it. And working with AI has been a way of, getting past some of those programmed notions of, what I should be doing as a contemporary poet, and has taken away some of the inhibitions and has actually liberated me to do things and experiment in ways that feel much more like me, that feel much more like my voice, as opposed to me trying to sound, like Tracy K. Smith or trying to sound like Anne Sexton or something like that.
So, last question. Have you ever been, so when you write a poem and you use AI, it's still Sasha, right? It's like Sasha plus AI. It's very much a collaboration. And I can understand that even better now listening to you describe it all than I did as I was prepping. But I can go into an AI model of my choice and say, write a poem in the style of John Ashbery, write a poem, whatever I want. Have you ever been moved emotionally by a pure AI poem?
All the time. I mean, that's why I keep doing what I'm doing, because, there's a lot of bad AI poetry out there. There's also a lot of terrible human poetry out there, and a lot of derivative human poetry. But I do this because there are genuinely moments when I'm working with the machine where I am stunned by what comes out. And, it really does make me stop and think, what does it mean to be human right now? What does it mean to be a poet? And to me, it's a really thrilling thing. The other thing I would say, just to kind of jump off that, is that I am not doing what I do because I want to become more efficient or faster at writing the kind of poems that we humans already know how to write. We are very good at writing poems, but I'm very interested in how AI broadens our sensory organs, opens up new creative realms, allows us to actually begin to imagine new ways of expressing ourselves, using language as a multimodal interface, and can actually maybe enable us to write poems we cannot even begin to imagine right now. Those are the things I'm excited to be working on. Not, write a poem in the style of John Ashbery, but like write a poem, in the voice of all of humanity.
When you mentioned bad human poems, I had a flashback when I worked at The New Yorker. I sat next to the poetry intern who got all the submissions, and he once got a big package, and he opens it up, and there's a cover letter, and it says, "Here are 742 of my poems. Surely one of them is good enough for The New Yorker." All right. Thank you very much, Sasha. It was amazing to talk with you. You're doing incredible work. Thank you.
Thanks
Thank you,
so
everybody.
much.